I'm Conor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. Pat, let me ask you a question. Have I ever introduced an episode with any other phrase?
Maybe. I'm not sure. That's a really good question.
Not sure that I have. Just one of those broadcasting patterns you fall into. But anyway, it's suitable, right? We want you to feel like you're part of the family. Hello. Welcome to Heavy Hands. Come in, have a seat, grab a drink, enjoy the show. Today, we are going to be talking about a very exciting fight. By the way, I'm Conor Ruebusch, your host, and joined by my co-host, Patrick Wyman. And we are taking advantage of this long interim between UFC events. There was a time, Pat, when a 3-week interim would not have actually deserved the title long, but such is the day and age in which we live. What a time to be alive, as people like to say.
Well, I mean, it's funny, since we started recording this show together, this kind of hectic schedule has been the norm, but it's almost hard to remember a time when that wasn't the case. But you don't have to go back that far. If you go back to 2013, the UFC only ran 30-something events. Yeah. Next year, they're looking at running 30-something events. It's entirely possible that we'll have a more relaxed, leisurely schedule moving forward.
Well, that's all right. It gives us a chance to talk about other things. Like, I was a little scared by it at first, but now I'm embracing it. I like the fact we got to do a Styles Make Fights episode last time. We got to do some more topic-driven shows. And today we get to do one that is, in fact, tied to a fighting schedule, but we get to leave the sport of MMA for a moment. Today, we are going to be talking almost entirely about Andre Ward versus Sergey Kovalev, the fight that has been titled, quite fittingly, Pound for Pound. That's the name of the event, I believe, or at least the catchphrase for the posters and the promotion. And holy shit, am I excited for this fight, Pat. And if you're an MMA fan listening at home and you listen to the show for MMA, I highly encourage you, of course, to listen to today's episode. I would make that recommendation anytime. But to listen in and watch this fight. This is going to be an excellent fight. It's one of those rare contests and one of those things that boxing as a sport is really good at, building something that is not only a hugely compelling style matchup, but an event, a fight between two fighters who are really at the top of their games. Both guys undefeated. Kovalev is undefeated, correct? He is. Both guys, in fact, 30-0 with one draw, slightly tilting the scales in Kovalev's favor. And maybe that's in Ward's favor. But the fight is just, it's amazing. It's such a big fight between these top contenders, the kind of fights that you really want to see. They don't happen as often as they should in boxing, but that's kind of what makes them so special when they do come around. And I am really, really excited to talk about it and even more excited to see it go down.
Well, so for our MMA fan brethren who may not be familiar with these guys, Andre Ward, undefeated, has not lost a fight since he was 13 years old, 2004 Olympic gold medalist, kind of famous as the smartest fighter you'll ever see. That's basically, if you had to describe Andre Ward, that's it. That everything he does is super technical, super crafty. He can win a fight in any phase, at any range. He is the prototype of the all-terrain fighter. He is formless. He is exactly what he has to be to beat any given opponent. Does not particularly care what it looks like, is happy to fight you rough, is happy to fight you pretty. Whatever is necessary to get him the W, that's what Andre Ward is going to do. Sergey Kovalev, by contrast, is the prototypical Russian puncher. Just a mean as shit. Might be the meanest fighter in combat sports, in high-level combat sports.
I'll say one thing that really I think sets Kovalev apart. There have been fighters in history who have killed opponents, who have fought people, and the fight has led to the opponent's death, and it has really messed with them. People like Emil Griffith, fighters whose careers were really never the same or who kind of carried that forever. Sergey Kovalev has fought a man who died after their bout, and I don't think he cares. And that's not a joke. It's not saying something cute about how mean Kovalev is. He is literally a mean fighter. I don't think he gives a shit about the well-being of his opponent, and that makes him a really interesting challenge for a fighter like Ward. I don't think Ward's ever faced somebody with that kind of mean streak.
Yeah, exactly. Like it is not an exaggeration to say that Kovalev is the meanest fighter in combat sports. It's not. Like that is from two people who watch a shitload of all types of combat sports. Take it from us. He might really be the meanest.
Yeah, he's up
But
there.
he just packs a tremendous punch, but is not like a brawler. He is a tremendously technical fighter who happens to be blessed with an insane amount of power and ability
Yeah.
to apply it.
And I think
So
we'll get the chance today, Pat. Sorry to interrupt you there. I think we'll get the chance to talk about styles. And so, do you mind if we jump in with Kovalev? We'll talk about Kovalev first.
yeah, go for it.
I think I'm going to make the case that Kovalev maybe is a bit of a brawler who has been reformed. We talked about that on last week's episode, fighters who don't tend to stick with one style for their entirety of their career. I think that under John David Jackson, Sergey Kovalev is a different fighter than he was early in his career. I think he still has I think he's more of a natural fighter than Andre Ward in terms of just being able to go with the flow and just throw punches and take punches and not care about any of it, only focus on hurting his opponent. But I think he is a reformed brawler in a way that John David Jackson has helped him to cultivate a really good stiff jab, has helped him to cultivate a better sense of distance control, helped him to cultivate a better sense of ring generalship, but that there is still a brawler in there somewhere. My question is, and this may be a controversial opinion as part of this question, is whether or not it's a good thing for Sergey Kovalev that he is a more orthodox technical fighter now than he was earlier in his career, that he is less of a pure brawler than he once was.
Yeah, I mean, without having watched a ton of Kovalev's early career, there's no question in my mind that the guy that we're seeing now is substantially better than he was.
Oh, yeah.
Like he has so many tools for dealing with it, for dealing with his opponent. So like, okay, again, for those of you who aren't real familiar with the broad strokes of Kovalev's game, he's big for the division. I think he's what, 6'1", and he's got a long reach. He's got tremendous power in his right hand, but I would describe him as a linear kind of fighter.
Yeah.
That basically he likes to push his opponent back, but it's not really based on the standard kind of pressure, like cutting off circular movement pressure that we associate with that. It's long leaping movements based on really long straight punches, and shift punches that carry him from one stance into another. He does a lot of really tricky things in terms of setting up his jab and moving his jab around. He's got a lot of different ways of landing his right hand, but it's mostly straight shots. Like that's really his bread and butter. These laser beam straight punches off of both hands.
Yeah, he's an excellent pursuing fighter. In fact, I think that's when he's most comfortable. You see, when he chains attacks together, like you said, Pat, he likes to shift. He likes to go from one stance to the other, transferring weight from side to side. Mostly it's jab, right cross. If he continues punching and the opponent is backing away, he will shift and kind of throw a left cross off the left hand and then shift back to orthodox. He likes to cover the distance that way. I think part of the challenge with refining Kovalev's game for his trainer has been making him a little more comfortable when he can't chase somebody. I think earlier in his career, Kovalev was not quite as comfortable cornering people as he is now, that he really wanted to follow people around the ring, and he's very good at it. It's something that I think is more viable in a ring than it might be in an MMA cage, because the shape is much more confined. You can follow someone along the ropes a little bit and still have some success. They don't have as many avenues to get away. And for Kovalev, like you said, it's mostly linear tactics. It's mostly the jab, it's mostly the right hand. Pretty much everything is a power version of that punch, but there's not a lot of circular attacks, upward attacks to Kovalev's game. I would actually describe him as a pretty, his skill set is pretty reductive. I think he's done a good job, and John David Jackson's done a good job of just kind of picking the things that really work best for Kovalev. He's mostly a jab and mostly a right hand. There's not actually a lot else to his punching arsenal. And what he has done, instead of like building a bunch of diverse combinations into his game, is he has learned to control the space of the ring better and keep his opponent on the end of those long punches so that he's harder to counter when he's not rushing in at them. And it's harder for them to get away and sidestep when he lunges in because their back is to the ropes. He's mostly keeping them there with single shots, and he still has control of the center of the ring so he can cut off your escape before you get back out.
You know what a good kind of a good parallel for the rear power hand linear aspect of his game is Conor McGregor, if
Sure.
you're looking for one,
Yeah,
where
actually,
to
it's a great
just
one.
like and more McGregor a few years ago, I would say, than now, when McGregor was way more of kind of a straightforward boxer than he is.
Hmm.
Um, like loves to back you up, not necessarily because he wants to flurry on you when you get your back to whatever the edge of the space is, but because that's where he has because he's long, that's where he can stick you on the end of his
Yeah,
shots.
and
That's
Kovalev
really
likes. Oh, go on. Sorry.
that's really what Kovalev wants is he doesn't want to be in the pocket with you. He wants to make you feel his power on the end of his range. He
Yes.
wants to stick you at the very end where you can't come back at him. And that's why the ring ropes are so useful to him, is because when you throw back at him, he has all the space in the world to move straight back.
Yeah.
His defensive footwork is not real circular. He doesn't do a lot defensively in the pocket. When you throw at him, he wants to take a step or two back, and then you're still too far away to hit him.
Yeah.
At that point, he can just reset and go back to peppering you with one or two straight shots at a time.
Yeah, his defense is not really much to look at in general, actually. Like a lot of long and tall fighters, his defense is his build. He keeps you on the end of his punches and steps back, and you're too far away, and he can clock you when you come in. And so it's difficult for most fighters who maybe lack the composure and the experience of Ward to capitalize on the fact that there's really not a lot of depth to his defensive skill set. He is not a defensive maestro by any measure. Not that he doesn't know what to do, but we have seen some really well-schooled fighters, or just some really gritty fighters, find a lot of openings in his defense when they either get comfortable with his power, or they just decide, fuck it, I'm going to come after him. But at that range, like you were saying, Pat, going along the ring ropes and everything, backing his opponent along the ropes, Kovalev is actually really good at setting up traps at that range. He loves to use the jab, and like I said, it's a ramrod jab. It's a very powerful left hand to sort of walk the opponent in a certain direction, or move their body in a certain direction to then line up the right hand. Almost everything Kovalev does is about lining up the right hand, whether it's jabbing and getting you to pivot away and expose your jaw to the right hand. He did that in the 7th round to Isaac Chilemba. Or whether it's keeping you on the end of the jab and jabbing you in the body, and then coming over with the right hand when you duck down to kind of absorb that blow, like he did over and over to Bernard Hopkins. Pretty much everything is the 1-2, but it's an educated 1-2. He knows how to get you responding to each of those punches to set other things up. Now, will that kind of limited skill set be enough for somebody who has enough tricks in their sleeve as Andre Ward? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, because what's striking about Kovalev's jab and cross is that he has multiple variations on every one of those punches, right? Like we call them jabs and crosses, but really that hides a tremendous amount of diversity in the way that he throws each of those shots.
Mm-hmm.
So he has a kind of a pawing jab, he has his lightning jab, he has more of a left straight that he throws off the lead hand, or that he throws as a shifting punch from more of a squared stance. He throws it to the chest, he throws it to the solar plexus, he throws it to the chin, he throws it at the eyes, right? So you have multiple different locations that he targets it at. You have multiple kinds of speeds that he throws it at. You have multiple feints that he uses off of the lead hand. With his right, he has a kind of a gorgeous backstepping right hand that he throws. He has the kind of standard cross. He mixes it, he moves it really well between the head and the body. And then he also has kind of a no telegraph, no weight transfer darting right hand that he likes as well. So each of those shots is like we say, yeah, he throws a lot of jabs, he throws a lot of crosses, but that hides a lot of diversity and a lot of variety in the way that he throws them.
Yeah, very, very different styles. But when I say that his game is kind of reductive, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I could compare him to Floyd Mayweather, the master reductionist, the most reduced skill set of basically any active boxer. I know he's not active anymore, but after years and years of cultivating his game, what did Floyd Mayweather throw? A jab to the head, a jab to the body, a sort of leaping left hook, and a lead right, and really nothing else. Like that, you would not find more than maybe 1 or 2 dozen other kinds of punches in any given Floyd Mayweather fight most of the time. uppercuts to the body, things mixed in. But the bulk of his game was built around these really simple tools. And what made it effective is that they were very educated tools, that he knew exactly how and when to use them. He knew how to adjust them. And he was comfortable kind of playing outside the rules that those tools would seem to ascribe. You know, Mayweather has a right hand, but he didn't throw the right hand just the way most fighters would throw their cross. He would fall off balance with it if it meant he could surprise you at a longer range than you expected to be hit. He would pull back and hit you with it as you came in, not put any power on it, but just go for speed. There's a lot of variation in each of those tools. And that's how Kovalev is too. His style is obviously very different, and it's much more geared around power punching, but it's really, his game is all about how can he adjust the utility of his different attacks? How can he come in with a jab to different targets and at different speeds, or double up that jab, or feint it? At what different ranges and at what angles can he throw the right hand? Now, I do still think it may be a problem for him that he lacks sort of comfort and familiarity with other attacks that I think would suit him against an opponent like Andre Ward. I think that may, in fact, give him some problems. But in general, in more favorable style matchups or more equal style matchups, they have these kinds of attacks have served Kovalev really well, and that's bolstered, of course, by the fact that, like we said before, he's really goddamn mean. He's incredibly durable. He has really good stamina. He can throw power punches for 12 rounds, and he doesn't really appear to tire that easily, at least against most opponents. And he's, he responds very, very well to firefights. I said, I think I did an article before his first fight with Jean Pascal. I talked about, game planning for Kovalev, how to beat Kovalev, talked about how counterable he was when he shifted and came forward into the pocket. Basically, everything I talked about, Jean Pascal did those things, and it didn't really bring him that close to winning the fight. It was a closer fight than most of Kovalev's fights, but he couldn't outgun Kovalev. And that's the challenge, is how do you go in there with somebody who has that kind of power, which just changes the whole game. Somebody who has that kind of power and that much tenacity, the durability to go with it. Somebody who basically can't be scared away or stopped by most methods. And so we'll take a quick break here, but going into the second section, I want to, as we talk about Andre Ward, I want to pose what I think are kind of the two questions of this fight, questions for either fighters. For Kovalev, how does he respond when he can't easily hit or corner his opponent? Does he get frustrated? We know he can't be scared, but often fighters who don't get scared off, who get harder and tougher when you try to fight back, they tend to be easily frustratable. They tend to get inside their own heads and get worried about the fact that they're not hitting you. And then number two, how does Ward respond to an opponent that he can't scare off? Can he focus entirely on frustrating someone, or is he going to try and stand his ground and impose himself on Kovalev, and could that be a death sentence for him? So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about Andre Ward and the game plans for this fantastic fight. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. Welcome back. So Pat, Andre Ward deserves some shine here. Had a long layoff away from the sport for, I want to say, 2 or more years. Was he sidelined because of legal troubles with Goose and Tudor Promotions, his management, and now comes back after this long layoff, has 2, okay fights against not exactly top-tier contenders, but basically announces his intention to move up to light heavyweight to face someone like Sergey Kovalev down the line. We can basically say he's taken these last 2 fights to kind of prepare himself for a fighter like Kovalev. He has been polishing off the rust after the layoff, and now he's back. And Andre Ward, for many, many years, was topping most people's pound for pound lists. He kind of quickly rose to that place, beating guys like Arthur Abraham, Mikhail Kessler, guys like Chad Dawson and Carl Froch, and then that's when his layoff happened. And so we have to kind of wonder if he's still at the top of his game, and does he still deserve to be called one of the best pound for pound fighters on the planet? What do you think?
I think he does. Yeah, I think his performances against lower level opponents and Brand, and who was the guy he fought before that, Sullivan Barrera. So in his fights since returning from, and who was it before that? It was
Edwin Rodriguez and Paul Smith.
Yeah, so basically, since he has returned from his layoffs, so there was also a shoulder injury in there, if memory serves, not just the promotional bit.
That's true.
So since he's returned, he beat Paul Smith too. So since he's returned, like, these fights have not been that competitive. They haven't necessarily been all that exciting or compelling as action fights, but the level of technical craft is undiminished. At no point really has Ward been in anything resembling trouble. I think he's dropped maybe 1 or 2 rounds over the course of those fights. He's ridiculously skilled. He's not maybe the athlete that he was in 2010, 2011. Mm-hmm. I think he's a little bit slower of foot, but his hands are still every bit as fast, and his mind is sharper than it ever has been. Like, he just knows what the right thing to do is in every scenario. Yeah. Like, that's what defines Andre Ward's game. Is like, we talked about the reductiveness of Kovalev's game. Ward is the exact opposite.
Yeah.
He has every tool that he needs in every particular circumstance. The only thing that really unites everything that he's trying to do, I mean, like, he can kind of stick and move on the outside. He can pressure when he needs to. He can fight you in the pocket. He can fight you at long range. The only things that really tie everything together are his jab and his ability to dirty box you on the inside. Everything else is negotiable depending on the opponent that he's facing.
Yeah, he's probably the most adaptable fighter in the game at this point. Probably style-wise more adaptable than somebody like Floyd Mayweather. And I think intellect really is the go-to descriptor for Andre Ward. More so, I think, than pretty much any other fighter right now. And it's not just an intellect in sort of fight feel that we've definitely seen. I'm going to bring up Mayweather, I guess, 100 times, like he's the only boxer I know. But as a good recent example, Floyd has excellent fight IQ, what we call fight IQ, but I think he's really a very feel-based fighter. He's got an excellent feel for the fight. His timing is excellent. If you look at who Floyd Mayweather is as a person, I don't think he's the most intelligent guy in the world. I don't think he's a moron, but I think he's, like a more emotional, sort of like a normal guy. And that carries through in the way he's trained. You look at the people who train him, and it's like Roger Mayweather, who's a smart guy, but, kind of quiet and more kind of old school, rugged boxing trainer. And then Floyd Sr., who, kind of similar. There's not a lot of, I don't think, really careful scientific adjustment being made to Floyd Mayweather from fight to fight. And then you look at Andre Ward, you hear the way that he talks, the kinds of things he talks about, the way he approaches different topics, the topics of his opponents. He's still got a little bit of dog in him. He is still a fighter, but he's very clearly a very intelligent man. And that obviously is reflected in his training with Virgil Hunter, who is a great commentator, just like Ward, does a great job commentating on fights because he's so cerebral. And I think Andre Ward is that guy, like Demetrius Johnson in MMA, who as a trainer, you could go into the gym with him and very specifically tell him what you wanted him to do and think out the process with the fighter. His trainer, I don't think, ever has to sort of trick Andre into doing something or get him to do something that he doesn't understand. I think he's a fighter who benefits from understanding exactly why he's doing what he's doing at any given moment, and that is how he fights. He knows exactly why he chooses to do whatever he does in every fight, from minute to minute and from round to round, from exchange to exchange. He's a very, very cerebral fighter. And just as Kovalev has that fight-changing power, more so than any opponent Andre Ward has faced, Andre Ward has fight-changing intellect, definitely more so than any fighter Kovalev has faced.
Yeah, I genuinely think watching Andre Ward, he might be the smartest fighter I've ever seen. regardless of combat sport. Just like his ability to understand what's in front of him, his ability to choose the right response from a series of possible responses is like it's almost hard to describe. Like I'm trying to think of a metaphor for the way he thinks, and it's very flowcharty.
Yes.
It's flowcharty in a way that I think we tend to associate more with mixed martial artists who have more boxes available to them in those flowcharts. But it's a very flowcharty way of thinking about things. Like George St. Pierre was a flowcharty kind of fighter. You know, I think Andre Ward is similar in the sense that like he knows he has a wide variety of tools at his disposal, and that from each of those possible responses to what his opponent is giving him is another series, like an exponentially greater series of things that go from there, and an exponentially greater series of things that lead from all of those options. And so picking and choosing at every point the right one of those available options and understanding what branches out of it and what are the potential risks and rewards of that, like all of this is happening in split seconds. And he's capable of carrying out those kinds of mental calculations as his opponent, like presumably a large, dangerous man, is trying to hit him in the face.
He has an Archie Moore-esque way of approaching fights. It's very systematic.
Yeah, that's a great parallel. Archie Moore is a great parallel for Ward, except unlike Moore, Ward doesn't have that kind of fight-ending power necessarily.
Yeah.
Like,
then again, he also doesn't have the discipline issues either. He's not like sneaking dozens of donuts and fried chicken to his room before fights because he doesn't want to cut weight.
Exactly. Yeah, he's not like Moore in that regard, but like Moore could always count on being on some level bailed out by his power.
Yeah.
And that is not a luxury that Ward has.
Yeah.
So Ward is this tremendously tight, tremendously disciplined kind of fighter who has both tactical and strategic plans in mind, multiple ones. I think he goes into every fight with plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and is ready to execute any one of those at any given time, not just in terms of like small tactical adjustments, but like he could change his entire game plan on a dime if he needed to, I think.
Yeah, that would not surprise me.
Yeah, so that's kind of what sets up this matchup is we have a real good sense of what Kovalev is going to try and do based on the way that he's fought pretty much everybody, the way that he's fought opponents who are in broad outline, kind of like Andre Ward. But Ward has a wide variety of potential tools to bring to this. Connor, what do you think his game plan looks like? How do you think he's going to try and fight Kovalev?
I don't know. There are a lot of options here. There is one more thing I want to say about Ward, actually, before we get into game plans, that I think is another important question to entertain before we talk about strategizing, which is, I said before that Kovalev is the more natural fighter. I think he's more of a bruiser when he needs to be than Andre Ward is, and Andre Ward has certainly made the decision to stand and trade with people in the past or to be aggressive, but I don't think he's as much of a... He's a little mechanical. The cerebralness of his game makes Andre Ward a little mechanical at times. I know there are probably people out there who wouldn't agree with me, but that's another difference between him and somebody like Floyd Mayweather. The fight feel for Andre Ward, it's like it's all intellectual. He knows exactly what to do, and he does it to a textbook degree of correctness, but isn't necessarily as willing as a guy like Kovalev to make, calculated risks by sort of abandoning technique when necessary. And that is why I asked before whether Kovalev becoming so much more disciplined is maybe a drawback for him. Because like Pacquiao for Mayweather, does becoming this textbook orthodox fighter maybe make you a little more susceptible to the intellect of a true defensive master, somebody who is going to rule the ring and dictate the fight as precisely as Andre Ward will?
So I now get what you were saying. I thought you meant kind of in the general course of his career, to which my answer was yes, obviously. It's better to be like that.
But for
in
Ward
the context of Andre Ward, not necessarily. I understand what you're saying. That makes perfect sense.
Is it maybe better to be kind of unorthodox and freeform and just a sort of recklessly mean bastard? Because Andre Ward, like you said, he's not going to hurt Kovalev like past fighters have. He could have that moment where he just knocks Kovalev's head off and we're all shocked because the punch was just perfectly placed. We compared him to Demetrius Johnson. He could have that DJ versus Joe Benavidez moment. It could certainly happen, where the guy who doesn't knock anybody out knocks out the guy who's never been knocked out. But chances are he's not going to be able to hurt Kovalev. And guys who have been able to hurt Kovalev have not been able to stop Kovalev. And so would it have maybe been better for Kovalev to just rely on the fact that Andre Ward can't stun him, can't hurt him, and that he can just kind of try to run him over. Because I do wonder if maybe there isn't that natural fighter in Andre Ward, if maybe his thoughtfulness could be used against him in that kind of situation where he is just, everything he knows is predicated on being an extremely well-schooled fighter. And how do you do that against somebody who is really naturally well endowed to succeed in a fist fight?
I'm going to give that a little less flattering of a take for Kovalev. I think Kovalev is a bully, and
sure,
normally that works in Kovalev's favor because he can bully everybody, right? Because he's so big, he's so powerful, he's really fast too. That's not that's not something that we've mentioned, but he is, for a big, strong, powerful guy. He is real fast. He covers a lot of ground real quickly. Now, when you're used to being able to run everybody over, and Kovalev has never run into somebody that he can't really run over, what happens when you get in there with a guy who understands that, knows, is aware that that's a thing that's going to happen to him, and isn't scared of it? Because I don't think that Ward is going to be scared of that. I think that that's, in the way that Ward thinks about fights, I think that's just another variable for him to deal with, and he can account for it, and he can deal with it. So my question is, I think the big defining thing here is, what range does Ward try to fight Kovalev at? Does he say, okay, I know that Kovalev does his best work at long range, and do I try and avoid that, or do I think that I'm a better long range fighter than he is? Do I want to try and avoid the pocket? So those are basically the questions you have to ask if you're Ward. Do you want to fight him in the pocket and on the inside, or do you want to fight him all the way out and on the inside? What do you think the answer to that is?
I think for Ward, it's got to be both. I think it has to be a mixture of tactics. I'm not sure it would be a great idea to just come out and immediately tie up with Kovalev. I think he needs to assert himself a little bit in the range that Kovalev thinks he owns. He can't give Kovalev this sort of mental out to think that, all right, well, if I break this clinch, all I need to do is wallop him with a big shot, or I can maybe roughhouse with him and push him away and come after him with the right hand. I think he needs to kind of assert himself in that long range and then use the openings that assertion creates to get inside. And that is a really big advantage for Andre Ward in this fight. Is that I don't think there's anybody who's better at riding punches into the pocket than Andre Ward. Nobody in the boxing game today is better at slipping under a punch and timing that with a step at the same time, coming into range, and just completely closing down that distance before the punch can come back. And Kovalev doesn't really have a great response to infighting. I think it's pretty simple. We were saying before the show began, he basically guillotines people. He front headlocks you and then kind of pounds away at your body with his right hand, which sucks, and it's definitely attritive, and it can frustrate you if you're not very good at getting inside. But that works really best against fighters who don't have really good control of their posture. That's like Vladimir Klitschko versus Alexander Povetkin, when he just keeps coming in head first, bent over, eyes on the ground over and over, and Klitschko leans on him, and of course it's frustrating. Klitschko just keeps leaning on him. Nobody wants to see that. But at a certain point, you've got to start yelling at Povetkin, why do you keep ducking your head and falling into the clinch like that? That's why he's having such an easy time of putting his weight on you. And Andre Ward is very careful to maintain his posture when he comes in. He bends at the hips, he bends at the knees, he tucks his chin behind his shoulder, he doesn't duck his head down or take his eyes off his target. He very smoothly sort of slides into the clinch when his opponent punches at him and when they miss.
Yeah, this is what I was getting at with the idea of Kovalev as a bully. That when Kovalev is on the inside, he's not a tremendously crafty fighter in that range. What gets him through is the fact that he's bigger and stronger and meaner, right? And so in his second fight with Jean Pascal, when Pascal came inside, Pascal had some success fighting in that range, but Kovalev was just so much bigger and so much stronger. And Pascal is not a small guy. Yeah. Pascal is big. Is big, thick, and muscular, is not used to getting tossed around, and Kovalev kind of sunned him there. Now, if you're Andre Ward, you're going to be giving up a fair bit of size. I think he's probably going to be giving up, what do you think, 8 or 10 pounds to Kovalev at least?
Yeah, wait, interestingly, BoxRec does list them at basically the same size in terms of frame. Kovalev, I think, will be the heavier fighter, but according to BoxRec and Wikipedia both, they're both 6 feet tall, and Kovalev has only an extra 1.5 inches of reach.
Really? I felt like Kovalev was at least an inch taller.
It really feels like Ward is significantly smaller. But the thing is that no matter what, I think he will probably weigh a little less. He'll probably cut less weight. I mean, I don't think he didn't cut much weight to make super middleweight. And at light heavyweight, I think it's basically just a matter of him not cutting weight at all. If maybe a small amount. Whereas I think Kovalev probably does cut to make the limit. But no matter what the size is, Andre Ward will definitely fight smaller. He will definitely get lower. He will definitely change levels more than Kovalev does, who is a very upright fighter for the most part.
Yeah, so I expect to see when they get inside. I think Kovalev is going to be used to tossing guys around, and if you're Ward, I think you want to bait Kovalev into that. I think you want to say, I think you want to let Kovalev get on the inside, think that he's having his way, and kind of slowly but surely turn up your pace and volume on the inside and bait him into more of those exchanges. Like, not like you want to be hit by Kovalev on the inside, but if you're Ward, those exchanges favor you, especially as the fight goes on, especially if you're Ward, you've got to be kind of committed to wearing Kovalev down, to working the body, to try and slow him, to try and pull his hands down away from his face, work on some of that legendary durability.
Yeah, and I did say that Ward's maybe like a little stiff and mechanical compared to someone like Kovalev who just kind of flows. But Ward's intellect is that of a student of the game. He's not textbook just in the sense that he has gone to the textbook which abides by the boxing rules and learned all of those techniques to perfection. He's textbook of like the secret gritty book that gets hidden under the ring when the commission comes around with like all of these dirty tricks on the inside. He has a bit of Bernard Hopkins in him. He has a bit of Archie Moore in him. He will use his head to grind against an opponent. He will use his elbows on the inside. He will hit and hold at the same time. He can get a little gritty on the inside. It's not like nothing about Ward seems emotionally driven. It all seems very calculated, but he is a calculatedly dirty fighter, and that's often the most dangerous kind. Is someone who's willing to get rough, but doesn't do it because they're getting frustrated, doesn't do it because they see no other options, doesn't do it because they're angry and they really just want to hurt the opponent. He does it because everything Ward does is like an investment in the future success of his approach. And so if he's going to get inside and hit the body a bit and grind away with his elbows and his forehead and make things a little dirty, I think that does benefit him, because Kovalev is the opposite. He is the guy who he will definitely do dirty things, but it's all in pursuit of just like punishing his opponent. He really wants to stop you and hurt you and prove to you that he is the bigger, stronger, meaner man. It's kind of a bully mentality. And so are we setting this up to be Revenge of the Nerds in a boxing forum? Is that what this is, basically? It's like the geeky, quiet, soft-spoken guy beats up the bully by being smarter than him.
No, I mean, I really feel like that's kind of the dynamic here, though. Like, not to oversimplify it, it's how does somebody with an infinite toolkit and the kind of intellect that Ward possesses solve the puzzle of Sergey Kovalev, of a guy who's bigger, stronger, faster, hits way harder, and is kind of naturally way meaner. That's like, I think it's entirely possible that Kovalev just absolutely clocks him and knocks him silly. That is absolutely a thing that can and may well happen in this fight.
It's not like Ward can't be hurt. He got hurt really bad way back in his fight with who's like classic journeyman. I'm trying to remember his name.
He got hurt by Arthur Abraham in the 12th round, didn't he?
He did get stunned by Arthur Abraham, but Darnell Boone, the journeyman king, he got hurt really badly by Darnell Boone. A lot of people thought he should have lost that fight. So he has been hurt in the past and kind of shaken, almost mentally shaken, by not being a super gritty fighter, by everything being so by the book, you know?
Yeah, so that's the path here. Like, that's a way that Kovalev can win the fight. But I don't know. So if we've got to make picks, I'm taking Ward because I think his bag of tricks goes so much deeper, because I think he has so many more solutions. And I think, like we talked about this at the very beginning, the linear nature of Kovalev's game, I think, does not serve him well against somebody like Ward, whose footwork and fundamentals are so good that all of Kovalev's movements, almost all of Kovalev's movements, are so big and so sweeping and so long. There's a lot of room in there to operate. If you're a precise, tight, technical fighter, it's not necessarily a comfortable range to be at, but if you've got the cojones to be in those spaces with Kovalev, you can hurt him. You can do a lot of damage there. You can especially work his body on the counter. If you can come under his right hand as he throws it with left hooks to the body. If you're willing to stand in there, move your head, move your feet in those spaces, you can make your hay there. You can do.
Ward is a prolific body puncher. He is like you said, he doesn't have huge power. A lot of arm punches, really. I think he kind of prefers speed and efficiency to putting his weight behind punches, but he will attack the body early and often throughout the entire 12-round contest. There was a point, Pat, not long ago, actually, where I was thinking that Kovalev would win this fight. I was thinking that Ward would struggle with the size difference and the power, that maybe he'd lost too much of a step athletically, and just kind of this feeling that Kovalev is this unstoppable force. But that is an illusion that kind of comes apart when you watch Sergey Kovalev's fights. If you really watch his fights carefully, the illusion that he can't be beaten starts to vanish. Just like if you watch a bunch of Dan Henderson fights, looking for times that his right hand doesn't flatten his opponent, you realize that it is in fact possible to survive the H-bomb. You know what I mean? Like, you don't go into every fight from that point on thinking one right hand and it is all over. You think it might be over, but really that's not a great chance of winning. Kovalev's the same way. You watch him fight, and that's the power puncher's true power, isn't it? It's not really that their punches hit so hard. It's that people are scared of getting hit by the punches. It's the fact that they've knocked everybody else out. The fact that they're stopping everyone, that no one can stand in their way. They seem like this runaway freight train that you just can't stand in front of and survive. I think Kovalev's power is even more scary than it is effective. And that's, not to say that his power isn't effective, but Andre Ward, I think, is a rare opponent who is not going to be stymied by that kind of obstacle, who's not going to look at a guy who's running through everyone and even entertain the thought that he can't find a way to beat him. And that is really, really rare to have someone who is that thoughtful of a fighter, who is calculated enough to see the holes in that kind of approach. I could go from a really basic standpoint and call back last week's episode and say that boxer beats slugger, which is a really reductive way of looking at this fight. But the more you watch it, that's kind of the more what it looks like, is that you've got Kovalev the slugger and Andre Ward the boxer, and there's just such a gulf of technical ability and scientific fighting between them that it's hard not to pick Andre Ward in the end. So I'm going with Andre Ward as well, and I think he'll probably get a decision over Sergey Kovalev. Don't envision him stopping him. If anything, I think if someone gets a knockout, it's obviously, I think, going to be Kovalev. The one final thing I do want to say, the fight that had me really worried, not worried, not like I don't enjoy watching Kovalev fight, but the fight that had me thinking that Kovalev would beat Ward was the Bernard Hopkins fight, because that was a really crafty, old school, another very intelligent fighter who Sergey Kovalev just kind of had his way with. The difference, I think, there is that Bernard Hopkins has always been sort of a safety-first fighter. He is of that old school where, and he did do this in his young career, you just travel around to wherever and fight anybody on short notice. And he came up fighting that way. And, maybe that also has something to do with learning largely to box in prison as a convicted felon. And so Bernard Hopkins was always a guy who, if he knew you could stop him and there was a good chance of you hurting him, he would prioritize surviving over winning. And I don't think that's Andre Ward quite the same way. I think that's the big difference between him and a guy like Hopkins. They both get dirty inside. They're both super crafty, both incredibly skilled, both very difficult to hit and even harder to hurt. But Andre Ward, I think, does have a little more dog in him than a guy like Bernard Hopkins. I think Andre Ward takes a front when you insult him or when you think you can beat him. I think he has a little bit of that ego that makes him want to not just not get stopped by you, but beat you. I don't think Andre Ward is a guy who can stomach a moral victory. I think he wants actual victory every time. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to make out and I don't think it was either your or my intention to make out that Kovalev is somehow a dumb fighter, because he's not. He's very, very crafty and has a really good idea of what he wants to do and how he wants to do it. Like, operating with a fairly basic set of tools, he has a lot of different ways of applying those tools, and they're ways that can change on the fly in his fights. That was not the impression that we were trying to give here. It's just that Ward is so smart that he's miles beyond practically everybody else.
It's not a fight between a smart guy and a dumb guy, but I think it's probably going to be one of those fights where one fighter makes the other look dumb. You know what I mean? Where they have a few moments where it kind of looks like they don't know how to solve this problem in front of them, while the other guy knows exactly what he's doing. Of course, that'll make me sound dumb if Kovalev goes and sparks Andre Ward out cold with one shot on the chin. So,
yeah, well, no, but I don't think it necessarily does. I think there's a real chance that Ward kind of outsmarts himself here. That's it, that if you're Kovalev, I think you need to be thinking in those terms, that Ward comes out with some kind of cutesy plan for how he wants to break you down over the course of the whole fight, and you're like, well, fuck it, okay, let's throw bombs.
Yeah.
And that he can bait Ward into exchanging with him, because Ward, thinking in his head, well, okay, I'd rather be in the pocket with Kovalev than on the end of his shots. Well, I'm going to exchange with him a little bit. And Kovalev comes out and shows one punch that Ward isn't prepared to deal with, or something like that.
Yeah.
I think there's a real chance that happens too. I just think that if you in your head run this fight 50 times, it's more likely that Ward is going to win 32 of them.
We've said systematic, and I think that's the way it goes. Andre Ward will have likely calculated the least risky path to victory. Not the least risky path through the fight like Bernard Hopkins did, but the least risky path to victory. And so 7 times out of 10, I think Andre Ward wins that fight.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay. Well, that wraps up our discussion. Both of us picking Andre Ward. We'll see if I was wrong to have changed my mind, but that fight is taking place, November 19th?
It is November 19th. Yeah, I believe there are 2 UFC events that day. I'm not sure why, but I believe there are 2 UFC events that day.
I can tell you right now, I'm probably going to skip both of them. I'm definitely more interested in watching this.
This is going to be the jam right here.
Absolutely. So we hope you guys enjoyed that discussion. We're going to take one more break, and when we come back, we have a segment topic suggested by one of our patrons. So we will be discussing next top fighters in MMA who are not quite championship status, and what changes we would make to those fighters to bring them to that level, what changes we could suggest. So we'll get to that question after this break. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back, so with no further ado, let's get to our segment suggestion. I couldn't recall, Pat, if we actually played that sound effect for segment topics or just questions.
Well, I think let's make some use of it. We've got the sound effect. It's
right.
A fantastic sound effect. Let's put the goddamn thing to use.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And also, I do apologize to anyone who was surprised by that sound. I know some people last week were saying, can't Conor introduce the sound? Isn't there some way to prep me for the shocking noise that I heard before the question? I wasn't ready for that. There's just no way around it. So it's going to take some of you off guard, and I apologize. But our segment idea comes to us from Ben Cohn, one of our $20 Patreon patrons. And Ben says, if you took a fighter just below the elite of their respective division and could add one tool or change to their fighting style or game, what would you add to make them a championship-level fighter? For example, giving more power to Michael Bisping or giving Ryan Bader an iron chin. This could also be something like adding an educated left hand to the game of Andrei Arlovsky. What do you make of that, Pat? We thought of a few examples. Why don't you, we can either list them all or we can go through them one by one, and you can tell people the fighters we wanted to talk about.
I think that's a really fantastic question because there are a couple of different ways to approach it, right? There's the idea of do you like, are there really that many fighters who are one thing away, or is it a complex of things that you would need to change to bring some of these fighters from the kind of perennial bridesmaid but not bride level that we see them at to the very top? But but we came up with a few examples. I think one that comes to mind at this point is Edson Barboza for me. I think because of the combination of a somewhat questionable chin and actually it doesn't look like this if you watch him fight, but you notice the results don't lie. A lack of power in his hands. He's got super quick hands, but he doesn't actually hit that hard. I think if either he hit harder, punch for punch, especially now that he's more dedicated to his boxing than he is to his kicking game, or he made him more durable, that could help him get over that hump. Conor, who comes to mind for you?
Well, it also matters to how you define a change, right? I think a lot of people tend to view this is, I know Ben doesn't think this, but we have been asked questions like this in the past where people kind of have this idea that if you add a certain technique to someone's game, it's going to revolutionize what they do. Sometimes that's true. But you also need to add like the understanding of that technique. You need them to have the ability to contextualize it. And often the fact that they don't have that ability is what keeps those certain techniques out of certain fighters' games. They just don't grasp why they should be using it or for what reason. So answering this question kind of depends on how you define what constitutes making a single change to a fighter. Are you going to add a tool to their game? Are you going to give them a different personality trait? Because that is often the problem. Fighters are not usually like video game characters where you can level up and learn one new move and it changes everything. Fighters are more like video game players, where if you don't learn what the different enemies in the game are going to do, you're going to keep getting fucked up with the same things over and over again. You're in control of the game, but only if you are empowered to be that way. So I think a good person for that example is Alistair Overeem, who is just below the cusp of the top of his division. If you look physically at Alistair Overeem, there is really nothing physically or technically that says he should not be a champion. But it is all in personality or character. It's all mental. It's all sort of ethereal rather than physical, because Alistair Overeem is super powerful. He's very fast. He's light on his feet and seems to have good stamina for a man his size, at least now that he's not like going crazy. But that, again, him going crazy is part of the problem. And he can wrestle really well. He's very difficult to take down. He's got a great submission grappling game. Pretty much everything's in Alistair Overeem's favor, except maybe his chin. And at heavyweight, like a lot of guys are going to get hurt and dropped by punches. He managed to hurt and drop Stipe Miocic in their recent fight. So it's not like he's the only one who can be knocked out in that division. The problem for Alistair Overeem seems to be mental, in that he doesn't seem to have enough heart. He has a bully's mentality, and one that I suspect is probably bred of some kind of insecurity, because he seems to lose faith in himself when the moment the fight is not going his way. Like, all it takes is one disadvantageous thing to happen before all of Alistair Overeem's body language changes.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of going too Wizard of Oz with this, this is the cowardly lion looking for a heart. If we're going to go with that metaphor Basically. Here, like that's like Alistair, like really, that's what he needs. He needs to be able to believe in himself when the going gets tough. And we talked a lot about Overeem's transformation and how the brilliance of what Jackson and company had done with him was to reframe in Overeem's mind when he felt like he was in control. Like, that was the whole brilliance of that strategy, because he could still be a bully fighting on the outside. He didn't need to be in your face with his hands on you, physically dominating you. If he could be on the outside, sticking and moving while you look like an idiot trying to chase after him, that to Overeem, like that in Overeem's mind was also bullying. He was also in control there. But there's no but like we saw how quickly that fell apart when Miocic got in his face. Like there is just
an opponent who did the opposite, who basically was like, to a certain extent, I'm going to abandon any kind of hope for technical superiority and rely simply on the fact that I know I can take a shot and keep coming. And it worked. That kind of approach beats the opposite. It beats the approach of the guy who needs to feel in control at all times because fighting is chaotic. And for whatever reason, Alistair Overeem is not mentally equipped to deal with the chaos of a fight against an opponent who is equipped to deal with his physical advantages.
Yeah, exactly. So who were a few other examples that came to mind for us, Connor?
We also talked about another pair of perpetual bridesmaids from the team that basically created that sort of idea in the minds of MMA fans, those being Uriah Faber and Joseph Benavidez. Faber more emphatically than Benavidez.
Yeah, but so you had a theory on Benavidez, right? Like that there was one basic thing, like really like a kind of an easy, straightforward thing.
Yeah, but I'm not sure how easy it is to implement. That's the thing. I think for Benavidez, if he just touched his opponent more before he tried to hit them, he would be pretty difficult to beat to anybody, including somebody like Demetrius Johnson. He's very difficult to take down. He hits hard. He's an incredible scrambler, possibly the best one there at Team Alpha Male. He's amazing at scrambling on the ground, and probably the best guillotine artist there too. At this point, certainly I think better than Faber, who kind of made that the thing of that team. And he's also very fast. He's one of the few guys in the division who can compare in that regard to Demetrius Johnson. But almost everything he does is a power shot. He strings those shots together really well, especially under the tutelage of Dwayne Ludwig, and we saw kind of a return to that when he fought Makovsky. Before that he was kind of back to old Benavidez a bit, sort of slowly deteriorating. He's ducking his head more, taking his eyes off of his opponent, swinging wild a little bit, getting into some scrappy fights. And against Makovsky, he was a lot more calculated. But there's got to be something mental there, because I imagine that Dwayne Ludwig would be trying to do that with him based on what he did with TJ Dillashaw, who is very much a touch, pow kind of fighter, a pat slap, as I've called it in the past. And that's Dillashaw's whole thing. Like, that's the biggest reason for his success, is that he can flow because he's constantly feeling where his opponent is. And despite that, with all the time he's spent with Ludwig, Benavidez has never really developed that.
He was a little better at it when he was training with Ludwig at Team Alpha Male. He did a little bit more of that. And then before he went back to Ludwig, before he left Alpha Male, he kind of dropped the volume again. So yeah. I think it could come back. But now we're kind of at the stage of Benavidez's career where he's getting a little older. It's probably a little more difficult for him to get into the kind of shape where he can throw that kind of volume comfortably. Yeah. So it's hard to say. But you and I disagree a little bit on Uriah Faber. I think the biggest problem with Faber is not any technical thing, but kind of the way that he approaches game planning and strategy in general. Like, I think he just he does what he thinks is game planning. And I think that what he thinks of as game planning is what other camps do at the most basic level to prepare themselves for like mid sessions.
Yeah. Like before they do anything in the camp, they're just going to watch a few fights.
Yeah. Exactly. So when I was at Jackson's last November, I got to hang out a little bit with Brandon Gibson, and I got to talk to Greg Jackson. And what was really striking to me about that camp, and this was really striking every time we've talked to Firas Zahabi, to striking when I've talked to Rafael Cordero, is how much prep they do on their own before they ever step into train with their fighters. Like, they have a good idea of what drills they want to run. They have a good idea of what sparring partners they want their guys to work with. Like, all of this stuff is second nature to them. They have all of this figured out as like, okay, this is how we're going to approach the specific challenge in front of us for this fighter. There is a detailed, in-depth plan there, even if they don't share it with their fighters. Like, some coaches do more so than others, some fighters more so than others, but there is always a plan. Right. Like, and this is true of ATT too. Like, Ricardo Laborio is big on this. Conan Silveira is big on this. The rest of the coaches they have at ATT, guys like Dean Thomas, like, they're all big on this kind of stuff, mm-hmm. Like, and it's not a coincidence that they are, like, because there are right ways and wrong ways to do things. And this is an example of that. This is just obviously the right way. I don't think Faber does that. I think that what those guys would consider basic preparation, he thinks of as the entirety of game planning.
Yeah, I kind of think I might agree with you, actually, that and maybe because I'm thinking more now about the connection between a sort of mental issue and a physical one. I think there are a lot of things that Uriah Faber could do to improve his game technically, adding a jab, an idea of how to feint, and adding tight footwork, a better understanding of distance, a better understanding of combination punching, just sort of a general refinement of striking ability would have really benefited Uriah Faber over the past few years. But But I think the reason I initially disagreed is because I don't know that Uriah Faber's focus on his opponents is as much a problem. He kind of strikes me as a guy who would benefit from better attention to detail with himself as a fighter as well. So maybe it's you're seeing it as how does he prepare for opponents, and I'm saying how does he prepare himself? How does he, rather than focusing on his opponent. Either way, I think Faber he seems to be a fighter who comes in and he has a trick he's worked on in a camp. You know what I mean? And there are great trainers and great fighters who have tricks up their sleeve. If you watch a Dwayne Ludwig fighter, they're going to do that dipping high kick or something like that. That's the thing that he has his fighters do. It's a trick he likes, and so they use it a lot. If you're watching a Jackson Winklejohn fighter, they're going to throw oblique kicks or side kicks to the leg. Those are things they like at that camp. Uriah Faber seems like a fighter who has accumulated a lot of tricks, but has never glued those together. And maybe that's the same thing with the way he game plans for fights. Is to him, a game plan seems to be he just has a sort of collection of tactics. Rather than a strategy that's really intelligent for what the opponent's going to present. He is a lethal fighter, right? Like, he's a guy who has a lot of finishing ability, and there's an extent to which that kind of makes sense for him, is that, like, if I do these tactical things over and over again, then eventually a fight-ending moment will present itself, right? So on the one hand, it's rational, but strategically, like, there isn't like I want him at a particular spot in the cage, or I want to fight him at this particular range, or this, that, and the other thing. I think that this particular punch to double leg is going to work really well for me, because then I can hit this. He watched, you pointed this out, I think, on Twitter, that when he was prepping for Jimmy Rivera, masterful performance by Rivera, by the way, in beating Faber there. And I was really glad to have predicted that one correctly, because I'm a big fan of his. But when Faber was preparing, you pointed out that I think he tweeted or put on Instagram something about how he was doing tape study, and he was watching Jimmy Rivera's fight with Dennis Bermudez from The Ultimate Fighter like 5 years ago, something like that, 4 or 5 years ago. And he's definitely
2011,
a very different fighter than he was then. And you kind of get the sense that he's like, well, when's the last time he lost? All right, I'm going to watch that. And I'm just going to do what Dennis Bermudez did or whatever. That he didn't really have a cohesive strategy. He was just looking for, he got knocked out by, I don't even remember what it was. I don't know, a right hand. And so I'm going to focus on this counter right hand. And that's what he comes into the fight with.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I very much got that sense watching him teach. Like, he was teaching really good techniques. They were really good tactics. Like, he was teaching particular sequences of knees and elbows in the clinch to particular takedowns to particular top control sequences. Like, it all made perfect sense as tactical responses, but it was never, okay, these all work when I have my opponent pushed against the fence. How do I get my opponent to the fence?
It's like if you have an entire fight based on the idea that you're going to look away and pretend to grab the leg and guard and then come back with the right hand to surprise the other guy. Like, what happens if that doesn't work? You've built your entire game plan on the idea that, and for a strategy, it's really more about categorizing tactics. You pick a number of tactics that you're going to train and focus on in training that will allow you to sort of press this overall theory of what your strategy is in the fight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he's an interesting one, but I think, but then we had some good examples of fighters who had for a long time been kind of limited, but then had made a couple of adjustments to push themselves, we now think, into that elite tier of fighter toward the very top. We talked about Gegard Mousasi and Donald Cerrone.
Yeah, guys that we think have actual, like, more title potential now than they ever have in their careers, and both guys who, for a long, long time, have been in that sort of bridesmaid category, at that second tier echelon. So let's talk about, we only have a little bit of time left, but let's talk briefly about what change Donald Cerrone made to his game. You said before, I think, Pat, that you thought mostly his footwork was the one big change.
Yeah, I think it's really basic. He needed to have tighter footwork, and everything else that he's put together off of that, whether it's been reactive takedowns or more emphasis on combination punching, especially a left hook, like, all of that stuff plays off of the footwork. Without the footwork, none of that other stuff matters. His command of distance is sharper than it ever has been. He panics less when opponents come after him and pressure him. He's more comfortable working in tight spaces. So that means that he's in a better range to do those things. Yeah. He's closer, which allows him to shoot better reactive takedowns. He's able to step off to an angle, which allows him to land that that left hook. He's less worried about getting drawn into a firefight because he's at better angles from which to throw combinations. So I think it's that simple for him. It was really just better footwork.
Yeah, how broad can I get? Because for me, for Cerrone, I would say the one main change he made was learning to box. Was kind of the thing that's made him the fighter he is today, as opposed to the one he was a few years ago. It's the footwork, but also better combination punching, better defense, better head movement, and a better idea of how to measure and set up his shots with his jab and with his feints. But really, I think the one big change for Cerrone, it seems to be Brandon Gibson. Like, that was the big change that happened for him. Having someone in his camp who was going to identify that he didn't have a ton of boxing ability, or that it hadn't been honed as well as it should have been, and making that one change. And it has been a really dramatic difference. There are still some of the problems for Cerrone, like the susceptibility to body shots, the fact that he's fighting bigger men, but he has done remarkably well in the welterweight division against a lot of opponents that seemed like they might have been bad style matchups for him, and not one of them has even come close to making Cerrone look bad. He has run over what seemed to be tough opponents in a new division. So that whatever you want, however you want to categorize the one big change for Cerrone, if you even can say it that way, it has definitely done the trick. And then for Gegard Mousasi, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think it's just sort of developing a bit of a mean streak, or maybe learning a sense of urgency. Either one of those, however you want to phrase it. For a long, long time, Gegard Mousasi was a guy who would happily coast through a fight, who would sometimes questionably lose fights that he had no business to be losing, or would just accept close wins when he was clearly dominating the fight. And there are two ways of looking at that. If you're dominating a fight easily, you can say, all right, I'm just going to ride this to victory. Or you can say, I'm going to make a statement, and I'm in fact going to protect myself by getting this guy out of here. Because it's better for me to only fight for 5 minutes and not have those extra 10 or 20 minutes of time in which I might suddenly lose due to circumstances out of my control. So he's now pressing advantages more aggressively, and I think it's a big change for him, a very dramatic change from where he was a few years ago, and one that I think makes him a very solid potential title contender.
Yeah, especially in a division where it's kind of up in the air. Like, we're not really sure, I don't think, how good Chris Weidman and Luke Rockhold and Yoel Romero and those guys are. Like, I think there's a lot of room, and definitely Michael Bisping too. Like, I think there's a lot of room for a guy who has the skills that Mousasi does, who has now seemingly the killer instinct and the mean streak that Mousasi does, to find a spot among the elite there.
I would pick Mousasi over Bisping.
There's no question in my mind. We talked about this in our post UFC 204 episode. Yeah, I would absolutely take Mousasi over Bisping, no question.
I might take him over a guy like Yoel Romero if Romero didn't wrestle the whole time. Like, if Romero was Yoel Romero and didn't decide to take Mousasi down over and over, which he's very apt to do, Mousasi could definitely win that fight.
Yeah, he could. There's a lot of room there for him to win that fight. That's hard to say. I don't know. Jesus, who knows? I might take him over Rockhold, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we're probably getting a little too high on Mousasi based on a little bit of success beating Vitor Belfort. Probably shouldn't say that much, but it's the way that he has had these recent wins, the change that he seems to have made. I definitely think he should be favored, just as he was the first time around in the rematch with Uriah Hall. And so, Mousasi for the title. I would like to see it. Everybody loves Gegard Mousasi. Like, he wears flip-flops and looks bored. Like, that's his whole thing, and yet he's so magnetic.
Oh God, he's so funny, man. Like, I loved his post-fight press conference. But at any rate, enough of this waxing philosophical about Mousasi, because we'll get to talk about him in a couple of weeks.
That's right. Yeah, he's now very active too, more so than ever before. He's just like constantly taking on fights, which is great. So that's it. Hope we answered your question, Ben. I think we probably more than answered the question. In fact, we've gone a few minutes over what we hoped for, but that's all right. Good discussions to be had based on that topic, and great discussion for Kovalev Ward. Super excited for that fight. Can't wait to see it. Next week, what do we have coming up next week, Pat? What's the UFC schedule?
Well, next week we'll be talking about Rafael dos Anjos versus
That's
Tony
right.
Ferguson.
That is right.
And a pretty stacked Mexico City card. We've got Alexa Grasso on that. And I would imagine, too, we will probably get a head start on talking about some of the awesome action from UFC 205.
Oh, yes.
Because that's coming up in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from Saturday.
We're going to have to get a head start because it is, like, as many people have said already, what UFC 200 was supposed to be.
It is exactly that. That is exactly what it's supposed to be.
Oh, I'm excited, Pat. It's going to be good. So, that about does it. What are you working on this week? What do you have coming out that people need to know about before we wrap up?
Oh, boy. I got a lot of things. So I had a new episode of the Fall of Rome podcast come out last week. I'm doing a little op-ed for Bleacher Report on a UFC 205 as the potential biggest show in the promotion's history. I think it's going to break all the records, maybe not for gate, but definitely for pay-per-view buys. And then I had the piece that I think probably my favorite piece that I've ever written came out. I did a thing on gladiators in the Roman Empire and why they disappeared, kind of the context that gave rise to them and how they grew out of a particular set of relationships between people in cities, between the elite in a city and the populace of a city, and the social contract, and how when that social contract disappeared, so did gladiators. But it's one of my favorite pieces I've ever written. Give it a read. It's on Vocative. You can find it through my Twitter or my Facebook page.
That sounds amazing. I'm going to play the old UFC intro, pay-per-view intro, while I'm reading it. The Gladiator.
It brings some honor to Gladiator Man.
Yeah, poor Gladiator Man. May he never be forgotten. As for me, man, I am just still trying to bust my ass on Ward Kovalev stuff. I feel like I haven't done anything in ages, but in truth, I'm doing a lot of scouting reports behind the scenes, and then Sherdog preview and all that will wait until next week. So keep an eye out for Ward Kovalev articles and videos. There will be stuff coming before that fight. I'm just, videos take a while, so I'm just grinding away trying to get some stuff done alongside a bunch of other things. So thank you everybody for listening. Thank you for joining us. If you want to suggest a segment topic, you can do that by pledging to support Heavy Hands on Patreon. $20 a month will get you a segment topic, and we're probably about to recycle. If you had a heavy bag question answered or a segment topic discussed and you're waiting for a new one, send us a new one. Send us a message on Patreon or comment on the post that is on the patrons only homepage that we have. And otherwise, that's about it. So thanks again, everybody, joining us. We hope you're excited about the fights, as excited about the fights as we are. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.